It would be hard to say what precisely the reasons were that had put the idea of this senseless funeral banquet into Katerina Ivanovna's muddled head. She really had squandered very nearly 10 of the 20 or so roubles Raskolnikov had given her for the expenses of Marmeladov's funeral. It might have been that Katerina Ivanovna considered herself under an obligation to her dead husband to honour his memory in proper fashion, so that all the residents, and Amalia Ivanovna in particular, should know that he had been no worse than they were, and possibly even rather better, and that none of them was entitled to behave in that stuck-up manner in his presence. It was possible that the decisive factor was that singular pride of the poor, in consequence of which, where certain social rituals are concerned, rituals obligatory and unavoidable for each and every participant in our mode of life, many poor people strain themselves to their last resources and spend every last kopeck they have saved in order to be no worse than others, and in order that those others should not look down their noses at them. It was highly probable, too, that Katerina Ivanovna wished, precisely on this occasion, precisely at the moment when she appeared to have been abandoned by everyone in the whole world, to demonstrate to all those nasty and worthless tenants that not only did she know how to do things properly and entertain in style, but that she had not been prepared by her upbringing for such a lot in life, having been reared in the noble, one might even say aristocratic, home of a colonel, and had certainly not been intended to sweep her own floor and wash the rags of her children at nights. These paroxysms of pride and vanity sometimes visit the very poorest and downtrodden people, among whom they occasionally acquire the character of an irritable, overwhelming need. But Katerina Ivanovna was not one of the downtrodden. While her circumstances might destroy her entirely, the prospect of her being mentally trodden on, that is to say, of her being intimidated and deprived by her own will, was not in view. Then again, Sonia had, with good reason, said of her that her mind was growing confused. True, it could not yet have been maintained that this was so in any conclusive or definitive sense, but the fact remained that recently, throughout the whole of the past year, her poor head had been through such a great deal that some harm had been inevitable. As medical men have observed, the serious onset of consumption also tends to cause a derangement of mental faculties. Wines, in the plural, and of different varieties, there were none. Neither was there any Madeira. That had been an exaggeration. There was, however, drink. There were vodka, rum, and Lisbon wine, all of the most inferior quality, but present in ample quantities. As for comestibles, there were, besides the traditional kutya, some 3 or 4 dishes, one of which incidentally was blinis, all from Amalia Ivanovna's kitchen, and in addition 2 samovars had been set up for the tea and punch that was to follow the meal. Katerina Ivanovna herself had seen to the purchase of the provisions with the help of a wretched little Pole who lived at Mrs. Lippevexel's heaven, knows only knew for what reason, and who had immediately turned himself into Katerina Ivanovna's errand boy, having spent the whole of the previous day and the whole of that morning rushing about frantically at top speed, apparently making a particular effort to render this latter circumstance as notable as he could. Every moment or so he had come running to Katerina Ivanovna, and had even gone out to look for her in the Gostiny Dvor, kept calling her Pani Choratsnya, and ended up making her sick and tired of him, even though at first she had said that without this obliging and generous man she would have been totally lost. It was typical of Katerina Ivanovna that she would hurry to deck out anyone and everyone in the brightest and most favourable colours, to praise them in such terms that would make people sometimes feel positively embarrassed, to ascribe to their credit various things that had never actually taken place, to believe quite sincerely and candidly that they had, and then suddenly overnight grow disillusioned with them, snubbing, abusing, and driving away with violent shoves the very person she had only a few hours ago quite literally worshipped. She was by nature cheerful, peaceable, and fond of laughter, but her constant misfortunes and reverses had made her desire and demand so fiercely that everyone should live in peace and happiness and not dare to live in any other way, that the very slightest dissonance in her life, the very slightest rebuff, would immediately send her into a state bordering upon frenzy, and in a single flash, after the most resplendent hopes and fantasies, she'd begin to curse fate, raging at anything that was on hand, and beating her head against the wall. Amalia Ivanovna had also suddenly acquired extraordinary importance to Katerina Ivanovna's eyes, and had received from her an extraordinary degree of respect, probably for the sole reason that this funeral banquet was being held, and that Amalia Ivanovna had decided to take a personal hand in all the preparations for it. She had undertaken to lay the table, to provide the tablecloth and napkins, the crockery, and so on, and to cook the food in her own kitchen. Katerina Ivanovna had left her in charge of everything, and had gone off to the cemetery. And indeed, it had all been magnificently prepared. The table had actually been properly laid for once, and although all the crockery and cutlery, the forks, knives, glasses, and cups were a mixed assembly of various styles and calibres belonging to different tenants, everything was in place by the appointed hour, and Amalia Ivanovna, feeling that she had performed her task with distinction, greeted the returning guests with a certain pride, grandly attired in a black dress and a cap adorned with new mourning ribbons. For some reason this pride, though merited, did not appeal to Katerina Ivanovna. One might think the table might never have been laid were it not for Amalia Ivanovna. She was likewise unimpressed by the cap with its new ribbons. For all she knew, this stupid German woman was simply proud of being the landlady, and of having consented out of charity to help her poor tenants. Out of charity. Thank you very much. In the home of Katerina Ivanovna's father, who had been a colonel, and very nearly the governor of a province, the table had on occasion been laid for 40 people, and Amalia Ivanovna, or more correctly, Ludvigovna, would not even have been allowed in the kitchen. All the same, Katerina Ivanovna decided not to make her feelings known prematurely, though in her heart she had determined that Amalia Ivanovna must be taken down a peg or two, put in her proper place that very day, or otherwise heaven only knew what ideas she might get, and for the meantime simply treated her with coldness. Another unpleasant circumstance was also contributing to Katerina Ivanovna's irritation. All of the tenants who had been invited to the funeral banquet, hardly any had arrived, with the exception of the little Pole, who managed to look in at the cemetery as well. The tenants who did show up for the actual snacks themselves were all the seediest and poorest ones, many of them not even sober, quite simply the riffraff. All the more senior and respectable ones were absent, as if in accordance with some earlier plan. Pyotr Petrovitch Lutzin, for example, who might have been said to be the most respectable of all the tenants, did not put in an appearance, and yet only the previous evening Katerina Ivanovna had told the whole wide world, in other words, Amalia Ivanovna, Polya, Sonia, and the little Pole, that this was a most noble and magnanimous man, endowed with a vast range of connections and a private fortune. Her husband's former friend, who had been received in her father's house, and who had promised to exercise every means possible to get her a sizable pension. We should observe here that in boasting of anyone's connections and private fortune, Katerina Ivanovna did so without any selfish aims or personal calculation whatsoever, pure disinterest, out of fullness of her heart, as it were, and the sheer satisfaction of giving praise and increasing even further the value of its object. In addition to Lutzin, and doubtless following his example, that nasty villain Lebeznyenatnikov had not appeared either. Who did he think he was? He'd only been invited out of charity, and because he lived in the same room as Pyotr Petrovitch, and was his friend, and so it would have been embarrassing not to invite him. There was also a certain fine lady and her overripe spinster of a daughter, who, although they had been living only for a couple of weeks in Amalia Ivanovna's rented rooms, had already made several complaints about the noise and shouting that had come from the Marmeladov's room, especially when the deceased had returned home drunk, complaints from which Katerina Ivanovna had naturally become aware from the lips of Amalia Ivanovna, when the latter, in the course of a row with her, had threatened to evict the entire family, shouting at the top of her voice that they were disturbing respectable tenants whose feet they were not worth. Katerina Ivanovna had now made a special point of inviting this lady and her daughter, whose feet they were not worth, particularly since up until now, whenever they had met one another by chance, the lady had haughtily turned away. So now she would learn that here we think and feel on a rather higher level and harbour no malice, and they would see that Katerina Ivanovna had not been accustomed to living in such circumstances. She had been planning to explain this to them at the meal table, along with the fact of her deceased father's gubernatorial status, observing in passing that she did so that there was really no need for them to turn away upon meeting her, and that this was extremely stupid. Neither had the fat lieutenant colonel, who was really a retired second-grade captain, shown up, but it turned out that he had been legless since the morning of the previous day. In short, the only guests who put in an appearance were the little Pole, a shabby office clerk with no conversation, dressed in a stained tailcoat, his face covered in blackheads, who gave off a repulsive smell. Then there was a little deaf old man, who was almost completely blind, had once worked in a postal station somewhere, and had for some obscure reason been living at Amalia Ivanovna's for longer than anyone could remember. A certain drunk retired army lieutenant, really a supply clerk, also arrived. He had the loudest and most indecent laugh, and can you imagine it? Was not even wearing a waistcoat. There was one man who sat straight down at the table without even saying hello to Katerina Ivanovna, and finally there was a certain individual who, for lack of any other clothing, arrived in his dressing gown. But this was considered so improper that by dint of vigorous efforts, Amalia Ivanovna and the little Pole managed to show him the door. The little Pole, however, had brought two other little Poles along with him, who had never lived at Amalia Ivanovna's and whom no one had ever seen at the rented rooms before. All of this irritated Katerina Ivanovna in the extreme. For whom had all these preparations been made after all? In order to save space, the children had not been seated at the table, which as it was took up practically the whole room, but it had places laid for them on the travelling box in the rear corner, the two younger ones being posted on the bench, while Polya, the eldest, had the task of keeping an eye on them, giving them their food, wiping their little noses, like well-brought-up children. In short, Katerina Ivanovna found herself with no alternative but to receive her guests with redoubled grandness of manner and a positive hauteur. Of some of them she took a particularly dim view, eyeing them severely and requesting them to sit down at table with an air of lofty superiority. For some reason, convinced that Amalia Ivanovna must be to blame for all the non-arrivals, she suddenly began to address her in an extremely off-hand way, which Amalia Ivanovna noticed at once, and which offended her vanity no end. A beginning of this kind did not augur a felicitous conclusion. At last they were seated. Raskolnikov had entered almost at the very moment of their return from the cemetery. Katerina Ivanovna had been delighted to see him, in the first instance because he was the only educated guest of those she had invited, and as everyone knew, was getting ready for a professorship at St. Petersburg University, and in the second instance because he had immediately and politely apologized to her for not having been able to attend the funeral, in spite of his earnest wish to do so. She had fairly pounced on him, had made him sit on her left at table. Amalia Ivanovna was seated on her right, and in spite of her constant fussing and fretting about the food being properly passed round so that everyone got some of everything, in spite of her tormenting cough, which every few moments interrupted her speech and deprived her of air, seemed to have become much worse during these past few days, she kept turning constantly to Raskolnikov, and in a semi-whisper pouring out to him all her pent-up feelings and all her justified indignation about the disastrous funeral banquet. At the same time, her indignation alternated with the most cheerful, the most unrestrained laughter directed at her assembled guests, and particularly at the landlady herself. "It's that old cuckoo who's to blame for it all. You know who I mean, her. And Katerina Ivanovna nodded his attention towards the landlady. "Look at her, making those big eyes like that. She knows we're talking about her, but she can't understand what we're saying, and her eyes are popping out of her head. Oh, the old owl! Ha, ha, ha! And what's she trying to prove with that cap? Have you noticed that she wants everyone to think she's making me a concession and doing me a favour by attending? I asked her, since she's a woman of social standing, to invite some of the better sort of people, and particularly those who knew my dead husband. And look who she's brought with her. Clowns. Chimney sweeps. Look at that one with dirt all over his face. He's a walking nonentity. And those wretched little Poles. Ha, ha, ha! No one has ever seen them here before. Not even I have ever seen them. So why have they come, I ask you? There they sit, neatly in a row. Pani, Hedge, she suddenly shouted to one of them. Have you had a bleeny? Have some more? Drink the beer. Won't you have some vodka? Oh, look, he's leapt to his feet. He's bowing. Look, they must be starving, the poor wretches. Oh, never mind, let them eat. At least they don't make any noise, although I must say I fear for the landlady's silver spoons. Amalia Ivanovna, she said to her suddenly, almost out loud, if anyone steals your spoons, I must warn you in advance that I can't be held responsible for them. She laughed, turning back to Raskolnikov again suddenly, nodding his attention towards the landlady again, and delighting in her own mischievous behaviour. She didn't understand that time either. She's sitting there with her mouth open. Look, she's an owl, a real old owl, a brown owl, wearing new ribbons. At that point, her laughter turned again into an unbearable coughing, which went on for all of 5 minutes. Some blood was left on her handkerchief. Drops of sweat stood out on her forehead. She showed the blood to Raskolnikov without saying anything, and as soon as she had recovered her breath, immediately whispered to him again in extreme animation, with a red spot on each cheek. You see, I gave her the most subtle task, one might say, of inviting that lady and her daughter. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? Well, she needed to do it in the most delicate manner possible, to employ all her tact and skill, but she went about it in such a way that country goose-cap, that overweening frump, that worthless provincial slattern, just because she's a widow of some major or other, and has come to plead for a pension and wear out her skirt hems on the doorsteps of the government offices, because at 55 she dyes her hair with antimony and uses powder and rouge. It's well known that even a frump like that did not see fit to come. Not only that, but she didn't even send her excuses for not attending, as the most ordinary rules of politeness demand. Also, I simply can't understand why Pyotr Petrovitch hasn't come either. And where's Sonia? Where's she got to? Oh, here she is at last. Well, Sonia, where have you been? I find it strange that you should be late, even for your father's funeral. Rodion Romanovitch, please let her in at your side. There's a place for you, Sonia. Have some of whatever you like. Have some of the jellied meat. It's the best thing there is on the table. They'll be bringing some more blinis in a minute. Have the children come? Polya, have you everything over there? Well, that's all right then. Now, be a good girl. Leonya, Kolya, don't kick your legs. Sit the way a well-brought-up boy ought to sit. What's that, Sonia? Sonia had at once launched into a hurried delivery of Pyotr Petrovitch's excuses, trying to speak her words out loud so that everyone could hear, and using the most carefully chosen and deferential expressions which she had specially made up on Pyotr Petrovitch's behalf, with certain adornments of her own. She added that Pyotr Petrovitch had particularly asked her to say that as soon as it was possible for him to come and see her, he would do so in order to discuss certain business matters confidentially, and come to an agreement with what might be arranged for the future, and so on and so forth. Sonia knew that this would appease and quieten Katerina Ivanovna, flatter her vanity, and most importantly, satisfy her pride. She sat down beside Raskolnikov, hastily greeted him, and gave him an inquisitive look in passing. During all the time that remained, however, she seemed to avoid either looking at him or talking to him. Her mind seemed to be elsewhere, although this did not prevent her from looking Katerina Ivanovna in the face in order to play along with her wishes. Neither she nor Katerina Ivanovna were dressed in mourning, since they had no such garments. Sonia was wearing some dark brown affair, and Katerina Ivanovna had on her only dress, a dark cotton one with stripes. The tidings from Pyotr Petrovitch had the desired effect. Having listened to Sonia gravely, Katerina Ivanovna inquired with continued gravity after Pyotr Petrovitch's health. Immediately after that, and almost out loud, she whispered to Raskolnikov that it really would have been a little strange for a man as respected and of such social standing as Pyotr Petrovitch to fall in with such unusual company, in spite of all his devotion to her family and his earlier friendship with her father. That is why I am particularly grateful to you, Rodion Romanovitch, for not having shunned my hospitality, even in surroundings such as these, she added, almost so everyone could hear. However, I am certain that it was only your special friendship with my poor deceased husband that prompted you to keep your word. Then once more she surveyed her guests proudly and with dignity, and suddenly she inquired of the little deaf old man, with particular solicitude, whether he would like some more of the main course, or whether he had been served with the Lisbon wine. The little old man made no reply, and it took him a long time to understand what the question was, even though his neighbours tried to shake him out of his slumbers. All he did, however, was gaze around him with his mouth open, which fanned the general mirth still further. Look at that moon-calf! Look! What have they brought him along for? Now, as far as Pyotr Petrovitch is concerned, I have always had great faith in him, Katerina Ivanovna went on in Raskolnikov's ear. And of course, I need hardly say that he's not like... And she turned to Amalia Ivanovna, loudly and abruptly, with an air of such extreme severity that Amalia Ivanovna grew positively frightened. Not like those dressed-up draggle-tails whom Papa would never have even engaged as cooks in his kitchen, and whom my deceased husband would have been doing an honour in receiving, which he would only have done out of the inexhaustible kindness of his nature. Yes, ma'am, he was certainly fond of a drink. That was what he used to like, a good drink, ma'am, the retired supply clerk bawled suddenly, downing his 12th glass of vodka. My deceased husband did indeed have that failing, and it's no secret to anyone, Katerina Ivanovna said, battening on to him suddenly. But he was a kind and noble man who loved and respected his family And the only bad thing was that because of his kindness he put too much trust in all kinds of depraved people, and heaven only knows who he used to drink with, men who are not worth the soles of his boots. Imagine, Rodion Romanovich, they found a honey-cake cockerel in one of his pockets. He'd come home dead drunk, yet he had remembered the children. A cockerel? Did you say a cockerel? Bawled the gentleman from supplies. Katerina Ivanovna did not favour him with an answer. She'd fallen into reverie and uttered a sigh. I expect you're like all the rest, and think I was too strict with him, she continued, turning to Raskolnikov. But you know it's not true. He respected me. He respected me very, very much. The man had a good, kind soul. And how sorry I used to feel for him sometimes. He used to sit looking at me from a corner, and I'd feel so sorry for him. I'd want to put my arms round him, but then I'd think to myself, if you do that, he'll go and get drunk again. And it was only by being strict that I could do anything to restrain him. Yes, ma'am, much was the tugging of his locks. Much was the tugging thereof. The supply clerk roared again, emptying another glass of vodka into himself. There are some fools who could do with a taste of the broom-handle, never mind the tugging of locks. And I don't mean the departed now either, Katerina Ivanovna snapped at the supply clerk. The red spots on her cheeks were glowing brighter and brighter. Her chest was heaving. She looked, given another moment or two, as though she might start a scandalous scene. Many of the guests were sniggering, and many of them evidently found this an agreeable prospect. People began to nudge the supply clerk and whisper things to him. It was obvious they were trying to egg him on. Permit me to inquire what you are getting at, ma'am, the supply clerk began. That is to say, on whose noble account you were just so good now as to... but never mind, it's just nonsense. A widow woman, I forgive her. Pass! And he knocked back another glass of vodka. Raskolnikov sat listening in silent disgust. He ate merely from politeness, picking at the titbits that Katerina Ivanovna kept putting on his plate every moment, and then only in order not to offend her. He kept giving Sonia fixed glances. But Sonia was becoming more and more anxious and concerned. She had begun to sense that the funeral banquet was not going to end peacefully, and was watching Katerina Ivanovna's mounting irritation in terror. She was, it should be noted, aware that the principal reason for the two out-of-town ladies having greeted Katerina Ivanovna's invitation with such contempt was herself, Sonia. She had heard from Amalia Ivanovna that the mother had taken positive umbrage at the invitation, and had advanced the question, "How can I possibly ask my daughter to sit beside that girl?" Sonia had a foreboding that Katerina Ivanovna somehow already knew this, and that the insult to her, Sonia, meant more to Katerina Ivanovna than the insult to her personally, to her father and children, that it was, in short, a mortal insult. And Sonia knew that Katerina Ivanovna would not rest now until she had shown those draggle-tails that they're both... and so on, and so forth. Just then, as though he had been waiting for precisely this moment, someone at the far end of the table sent Sonia a plate containing 2 hearts, shaped from black bread, pierced by an arrow, made of the same substance. Katerina Ivanovna flushed crimson, and at once observed in a very loud voice, the full length of the table, that the man who had sent it was a drunken ass. Amalia Ivanovna, also sensing that something unpleasant was about to happen, and at the same time wounded to the depths of her soul by Katerina Ivanovna's haughty attitude towards her, suddenly began, for no particular reason other than to divert the unpleasant mood of the gathering in another direction, and while she was about it, raise herself in the general esteem, to relate the story of how Karl from the pharmacy, an acquaintance of hers, had been taking a cab somewhere one night, and of how the cabman tried to kill him, and Karl begged him very, very much not to kill him, and cried and begged with folded hands, and was so very, very frightened that his fear broke his heart. And Katerina Ivanovna, though she smiled, also observed that Amalia Ivanovna should not try to tell anecdotes in Russian. This offended Amalia Ivanovna even more, and she retorted that her Vater aus Berlin was a very, very important man who went about with his hands in his pockets. Being easily amused, Katerina Ivanovna could not restrain herself and went off into terrible fits of laughter, with the result that Amalia Ivanovna began to lose the last of her patience, and very nearly lost it altogether. "There's the brown owl for you!" Katerina Ivanovna immediately began whispering to Raskolnikov. What was she trying to say? She was saying that he used to keep his hands in his pockets, but the way she said it sounded as though he was a pickpocket. Have you noticed, Rodion Romanovich, that it really is true that all these St. Petersburg foreigners, who are most of them Germans, come to settle with us for some strange reason, are all more stupid than we are? I mean, you must admit, what sort of story is that to tell about Karl from the pharmacy getting his heart broken with fright, and instead of tackling the cabman, folding his hands, the milksop, and crying and begging very, very much? Oh, the big bird brain! And I mean, she thinks it's very touching, and has no idea of how stupid she is. If you ask me, that drunken supply clerk's far more intelligent than she is. At least he doesn't try to hide the fact that he's a dissolute fellow who's drunk. He's drunk the last remaining shreds of any sense he may have had, whereas these foreigners are so sedate and serious. Look at her! Look at her, sitting there with her eyes popping out of her head. She's angry. Angry! Thus cheered and fortified, Katerina Ivanovna immediately launched into various details of this and that, and suddenly began to talk about how, with the help of the pension she was going to receive, she would most certainly open a boarding school for daughters of the gentry in her native town. Katerina Ivanovna had not yet told Raskolnikov about this matter herself, and she lost no time in throwing herself into the most alluringly detailed description of her plans. By some mysterious magic, there suddenly appeared in her hands the very same testimonial of good progress that Marmeladov had told Raskolnikov about back in the drinking den, when he had explained to him that Katerina Ivanovna, his wife, at the ball that was held upon her graduation, had danced with the shawl in the presence of the governor and other notables. This testimonial was evidently now intended to serve as proof of Katerina Ivanovna's right to establish a boarding school in her own name, but had really been held in reserve with the aim of removing the shine from those two dressed-up draggle-tails once and for all, if they should put in an appearance at the banquet, and of clearly demonstrating to them that Katerina Ivanovna came from a most well-born, one might even say aristocratic, family, was a colonel's daughter, quite certainly better than those adventuresses of whom there seemed to have been such a proliferation just lately. The testimonial at once passed from hand to hand among the drunken guests, something that Katerina Ivanovna did not try to stop, as it really did state en toutes lettres that she was the daughter of a court councillor and chevalier, and was consequently very nearly a colonel's daughter. Blazing with ardour now, Katerina Ivanovna immediately began to expand on all the details of her future bright and tranquil life. She talked of the male teachers from the local gymnasium whom she would invite to give lessons in her boarding school, of a certain venerable old man, a Frenchman by the name of Mongo, who had taught Katerina Ivanovna French at the institute she had attended, and who even now was living out his days, and would certainly agree to teach for her in return for the most modest payment. At last she came to the subject of Sonia, who would go there together with Katerina Ivanovna and help her there in all things. At that point, however, someone at the other end of the table gave a snort. Katerina Ivanovna, though she at once tried to pretend that in her scorn she had not even noticed the laughter that had broken out at the other end of the table, at once began raising her voice on purpose to talk with animation about Sofya Semyonovna's undoubted qualifications for serving as her assistant, about her meekness, patience, self-denial, good manners, and education, and she patted Sonia on the cheek, and getting up slightly, implanted 2 hot kisses there as well. Sonia blushed scarlet, and Katerina Ivanovna suddenly began to cry, observing of herself as she did so that she was an idiot with weak nerves and upset beyond the limit, and that it was time to bring the proceedings to an end, and since the snacks had all been eaten, that tea should be served. At that very moment, Amalia Ivanovna, who had by now taken thorough offence at the fact that she had not taken the slightest part in any of this conversation, and that no one had even been listening to her, suddenly risked making one final attempt to join in, and with concealed sadness ventured to communicate to Katerina Ivanovna a certain rather down-to-earth and well-considered observation to the effect that in the future boarding school it would be necessary to pay particular attention to the cleanliness of the young ladies' linen, die Wäsche, and that there would have to be one good lady, die Dame, who would see that the laundry was done properly, and that in the second place that none of the young girls read novels on the sly at nights. Katerina Ivanovna, who was really upset and very tired, and who had by now had quite enough of the funeral banquet, immediately snapped at Amalia Ivanovna that she was spouting nonsense and did not know what she was talking about, that concerns about die Wäsche were the province of the matron, and nothing to do with the directress of a high-class boarding school, and that as for her remark about the reading of novels, it was simply improper. She must ask her to be silent. Amalia Ivanovna flushed red, and losing her temper, observed that she had meant well, and had very much meant well already, and that Katerina Ivanovna had long not paid the debt for the apartment. Katerina Ivanovna at once laid into her, saying that she was not telling the truth when she said that she had meant well, as the day before, when her departed husband had still been lying on the table, she had importuned her about the rent. In reply to this, Amalia Ivanovna quite logically observed that she had invited those ladies, but that those ladies had not arrived, because those ladies were high-class ladies, and could not come visiting low-class ladies. Katerina Ivanovna immediately stressed to her that in view of the fact that she was a slut, it ill became her to make judgments about what high-class meant. Amalia Ivanovna would not put up with this, and declared in return that her Vater aus Berlin was a very important man who walked with both hands in his pockets and did everything like this, poof, poof. And in order to make the representation of her Vater more lifelike, Amalia Ivanovna leapt up from her chair, stuck both her hands in her pockets, blew out her cheeks, and began to mouth incoherent sounds that resembled poof, poof, surrounded by the loud laughter of all the tenants, who had been purposely encouraging Amalia Ivanovna with their approval, sensing that a skirmish was near. But this was more than Katerina Ivanovna could endure, and she rapped out, for all to hear, that more likely than not there was no Vater, and never had been, and that Amalia Ivanovna was simply a drunken St. Petersburg Finn, and had probably worked as a cook earlier, or even as something worse. Amalia Ivanovna went as red as a lobster, and shrieked that Katerina Ivanovna had probably never had a Vater at all, but she had a Vater aus Berlin, who wore a long frock coat and always went poof, 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 Katerina Ivanovna observed with scorn that her own origins were well known to everyone, and that in the testimonial it was stated in printed characters that her father had been a colonel. But that Amalia Ivanovna's father, if she had one, was probably some St. Petersburg Finn who had worked as a milkman. But it was more likely she had no father at all, since nobody seemed to know whether Amalia Ivanovna's patronymic was Ivanovna, or whether it was even Lyudvigovna, and that Amalia Ivanovna, flying at last into an all-out rage and banging her fist on the table, began to shriek that her name was Amal Ivan, not Lyudvigovna, and that her vater's name was Johann, and that he was a burgomeister, and that Katerina Ivanovna's vater had never ever been a burgomeister. Katerina Ivanovna rose from her chair, and sternly, in a voice that seemed calm, although she was deadly pale and her chest was heaving deeply, announced to her that if she dared to mention her rubbishy vater in the same breath as her beloved papa one more time, then she, Katerina Ivanovna, would tear off her cap and stamp on it with her heels. At the sound of this, Amalia Ivanovna began to rush about the room, shouting for all she was worth that she was the landlady and that Katerina Ivanovna must get out of her apartments this minute. Then, for some reason, she ran to collect her silver spoons from the table. Noise and uproar followed. The children began to cry. Sonia rushed over to Katerina Ivanovna in an attempt to restrain her, but when Amalia Ivanovna suddenly shouted something about the yellow card, Katerina Ivanovna shoved Sonia aside and threw herself at Amalia Ivanovna in order to execute her threat in respect of the cap, there and then. At that moment the door opened, and in the threshold Pyotr Petrovitch Lutzin suddenly appeared. He stood surveying the entire company with a stern and attentive gaze. Katerina Ivanovna threw herself towards him.